Americans are durable. We take pride in hard work and high quality. American Giant makes durable quality clothing right here in the USA because what we wear reflects who we are. When you buy American Giant, you're not just wearing the best clothes money can buy. You're helping keep jobs and pride in your own backyard. Premium clothing built to last decades, like it should. Get 20% off your first order at American-Giant.com with code RightHere24.
Step into the world of power, loyalty, and luck.
I'm gonna make him an offer he can't refuse.
With family, cannolis, and spins mean everything.
Now, you wanna get mixed up in the family business.
Introducing The Godfather at ChumbaCasino.com. Test your luck in the shadowy world of The Godfather slot.
Someday, I will call upon you to do a service for me.
Play The Godfather, now at ChumbaCasino.com.
Welcome to the family.
No purchase necessary. VGW Group. Void where prohibited by law. 18 plus. Terms and conditions apply.
I'm a writer. I know dialogue.
That's a fountain of conversation, man. That's a geyser.
Interesting.
Interesting. Yes, provocative.
Oh, Daddy, stand back, man. Woo! Rock and roll!
Welcome back to Booked on Rock, the podcast for those about to read and rock. Find the podcast online at bookedonrock.com. Every episode in audio and video highlights from episodes, blogs, the latest rock book releases. Back with another chapter in the Dialogue series, a chill and chat with authors, fellow podcasters, musicians, and more. Our guest is musician and rock journalist Tom Guerra. He's been a popular guitarist on the New England club circuit since the 70s, playing with a host of leading blues, rock and roll, and R&B acts. First gained notoriety after being featured in Guitar Player magazine in 1991. He's recorded or played with Rick Derringer, the Dirty Bones Blues Band, Max Weinberg, Mark Nomad, Sticky Fingers, the Easton Brothers with Muddy Waters bassist Charles Calmese, the great Jaimoe from the Allman Brothers Band, Second Son, Guitar Shorty, Adolph Jacobs of the Coasters, Kenny Aaronson, and the Delrays. He's also been writing for Vintage Guitar magazine since 1998. His work has been published in Premier Guitar, the ToneQuest Report, and Modern Guitars magazines. Tom, did I cover it all? Did I get them?
I think so. Yes, there's a lot there.
How you doing, man? Thanks for being here. You've been around. How you doing?
I'm doing great. How are you?
Oh, I'm doing good. Great to have you on the show, and I'm so
interested.
Oh, my pleasure. And I'm so interested in hearing about these amazing musicians you've worked with and your work with Vintage Guitars. But let's start with your background. You're originally from New England?
Yeah, originally from the Hartford area. I went to high school in Hartford. I went to college in Eastern Connecticut. Always have been playing music professionally since I was 15 years old. So a couple of years now, you know. You just always have loved music, loved writing music, write a lot of music, and also write about music. I love interviewing guitar players or musicians I really admire. It's easy work when you know the questions to ask because you know what they've gone through or what they've produced. And also work a lot in the vintage guitar area as well. Write for Vintage Guitar magazine for a long time, as you mentioned, and also do a lot of guitar work and just love everything guitar.
For those watching, you benefit. You get to see some sweet guitars that are behind
Yeah.
Tom. Tell us about those. What do you got back there?
Got a bunch of a lot of what you're seeing now are old Stratocasters, including that white one behind me, which was Howlin' Wolf's. Not that white one.
Really?
Yeah, that one. That was Howlin' Wolf's guitar. It's a pretty famous guitar. Has spent about 5 years in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Was out in the Fender Museum earlier this year in Fullerton, California, where it was built in 1963. Been in the Phoenix Museum of Musical Instruments, and it's a great guitar. And
how did you get your hands on it?
About 25 years. I bought it just as a '63 Stratocaster from a guy from Chicago. And then I was looking at the pickguard one day, and it has the words Lil Bill sort of etched into the pickguard. Like if you maybe put it on with like nail polish and it burned in and then somebody removed it. Then I started investigating who's Lil Bill. Come to find out Lil Bill is Lil Bill Wallace, who was one of the really important musicians around the Mississippi area that B.B. King grew up in. He convinced B.B. King to play blues because B.B. was thinking of playing gospel. And I tracked the guy down. He was in a nursing home at the time. This is in probably 2004, maybe. Sent him pictures of the guitar. He goes, that was my guitar. Oh, yeah, I had that for a number of years. I loved playing it. And I got that from Wolf. I said, Wolf who? He's like, Howlin' Wolf. Chester Burnett was a good friend of mine. He'd stay at my house all the time. And I got that guitar from him in about 1965. So I'm thinking, is this true or not? So there is near where Lil Bill lives is a Howlin' Wolf museum. I contacted them and I said, did Howlin' Wolf ever play a white Fender Stratocaster? I'm like, oh yeah, we'll send you pictures. And they sent me pictures, all right. And I opened up the envelope, held up the picture to the guitar, and the same nick in the lower bout of the guitar was on this picture with Wolf playing it in 1964. And I got like a chill when that happened.
Sure.
So
what does it just go from person to person to person? How does it wind up?
It just, we tracked it down. It went from Wolf to Lil Bill Wallace. Lil Bill Wallace had it until about 1970. At that point in time, Lil Bill Wallace was out of music. He was driving a beer truck. We think he sold it at a pawn shop in Chicago. And then it went eventually to the guy that I got it from. And I've had it for 25 years now. So vintage guitar, a couple magazines have documented this too. And it's really gotten around. So, and it still plays great. I was just playing it yesterday too.
Your website mentions Rory Gallagher, Paul Kossoff, Jimmy Page, Keith Richards, Ronnie Wood, Muddy Waters, Buddy Guy, and Joe Walsh as being big influences. Is there a common style or theme of those guys? Because they all play with feel and have a distinct personality to each of their playing.
Yeah, I think that is the commonality, is they're unique and they all play with feel. None of them are really shredders. And I do like some shredders too. You know, I was the first kid on my block that bought Van Halen 1 the week it came out because I heard that Sledgehammer version.
You see the hat
really
there, Tom? You see the hat?
Yeah, I saw that, yeah. But so I like all things guitar, but in terms of the stuff I write and play, those are the main guys that influenced me, and for all different reasons. So Page was incredible in his compositions. Rory was just probably my favorite live guitar player. I mean, he was just on fire. Kossoff, very much kind of like the original slow hand, very slow and stinging with that vibrato. So I really love that. And Clapton kind of started it all for a lot of those guys and really have admired him too.
Paul Kossoff, I think, is the most interesting of those names because there are some people that may not even know who he is, but he was the guitarist of Free.
That's right.
And died way too young.
Way too young. He actually, oddly enough, died twice. His heart stopped. They got it started. He lived another year. He had a lot of substance abuse problems. He died. He didn't even make the 27 Club. He died at age 25. A lot of your viewers might say, well, what songs did he do? It's like, turn on the TV every night. All Right Now is on a drug commercial, I think, oddly enough. And that's Koss's guitar in All Right Now. And that's just scratching the surface. He had so many great lines, and he was such an economical player where he'd do one note and it really would get to you, you know?
Yeah, finally got around to really exploring Free's music. Who was the first guy you worked with, and what was that experience like? Was it Rick Derringer? Like big time, big name.
First big name was probably, played with Jaimoe in the 90s, a bunch of gigs, played a little bit opening for Ronnie Earl, got to really know Ronnie and really respect his playing. Then when we were doing the first Mambo Sons album, I was on WCCC radio promoting a CD I was doing with a band I was with at the time called Delrays. And I got a call on the radio and a guy said, hey, I really like the guitar on that song. I said, oh, thanks a lot. This was like, when a song was playing in between being on the air. I said, do you play guitar? He goes, yeah, this is Rick Derringer. And I said, Rick, how are you? I said, I've always loved your stuff. And, I was just starting to write for Vintage at the time. I said, would love to maybe interview you. He's like, well, maybe we can work together at some point. So about 6 months later, I was starting the first Mambo Sons record and CD. I called him. I said, hey, I'm doing this. You want to maybe help produce it and contribute some guitar? And he's like, sure. So he came by and we tracked him, and he played some great guitar on that first album. And it's weird because Kenny Aaronson also played on that, and Kenny was Rick's longtime bass player. Kenny is still playing with me today as well. So we've got a real long history. But Rick was sort of the big name guy, first big name guy I played with, and worked with in a studio capacity.
You worked with Rick Derringer, as you mentioned. What was it like working with Rick? What did you do with Rick?
A couple projects he played on. I think he played on 3 or 4 songs off that first Mambo Sons album, and then helped. Really I learned so much about working in the studio from him, because that guy has produced everybody. And I mean,
Weird Al.
We even produced Weird Al. Yeah, absolutely. But I mean, you listen to the stuff he did with Johnny Winter. I think that's probably some of his best production, because he captured Johnny. And Johnny was a friend of mine as well. And I actually did the liner notes for a couple of his albums. He asked me to do that. And Johnny was a great guitar player too. And I think he thought very highly of Rick as well. So, but that right after that, Rick moved down to Florida. We kept in touch. I spent time with him down there as well. He's an amazing guitar player. I mean, people kind of put him in a box. So he was with the McCoys or whatever. But that guy could literally play anything. He could hang with Les Paul. He played a bunch of times with Les Paul and was doing all those jazz runs and stuff. He was a great help for me and really gave me a boost.
Yeah, the interesting trivia with him too is the Hulk Hogan theme song.
I Am a Real American, right?
Yeah, that's him.
And that song got a lot of play after 9/11, I remember too, when there was a lot of pro-America music going out there. I think he might have re-released it then and did pretty well with it.
Booked on Rock Podcast. We'll be back after this.
Patience, boys. All good things to those who wait.
It is Ryan Seacrest here. Everybody needs some variety in life. That's what I love about Chumba Casino. They know how to keep things fresh and exciting. All their games are free to play, like spin slots, bingo, and solitaire. You can claim free daily login bonuses, too. And they release new games every week. So spice things up with ChumbaCasino.com now for your chance to redeem some serious prizes. Sponsored by Chumba Casino. No purchase necessary. VGW Group. Void where prohibited by law. 18 plus. Terms and conditions apply.
I'm a huge Springsteen fan, so I got to ask you about Max Weinberg.
Oh.
What work have you done with Max, and how did you meet him?
That was a cool story. When I was in college, we would play quite a bit around the college circuit with a band called the Dirty Bones Band. And Max Weinberg had just written a book called The Big Beat, all about his favorite drummers. This is in 1986. As luck would have it, the first school he went to was Eastern Connecticut, the school I went to. And he asked the guy there, so, I like to play with a band. Can you hook me up with a band? He goes, I can hook you up with a band. So we ended up playing with him on that tour, promoting his book. He was really great to work with, perfect gentleman, really good drummer, solid drummer. But a couple of times it was funny because we were playing, I think it was, we did a bunch of covers like My Generation, stuff his favorite drummers, Keith Moon, Charlie Watts. So we played a lot of music that his influences drummed on initially. And at one point I told him I thought he was rushing the beat on something. And he looked at me like, I just played on the Born in the USA tour, and I'm thinking, sorry, but he was great. I mean, great to work with. And, another person that helped us out quite a bit.
Eastern Connecticut is Willimantic, Connecticut,
yeah.
Right? Okay. So you're familiar with the Shaboo Inn?
Very familiar with it. Yeah, I played
with
a bunch of those guys as well, too.
Okay. For those who aren't familiar, that aren't from Connecticut, this is a pretty legendary club. It's not around anymore, but it was the kind of club that had up-and-coming bands play there, and some maybe on their way down. But they had Aerosmith, The Police, all these bands that were on their way up. And
on the way up.
And there's a story I always remembered. I tell this anytime Aerosmith comes up in a conversation, that the first time they ever played Dream On was there, like in 1970. Okay, yeah.
Yeah, Tyler mentions that in his biography.
He does mention it in there. Okay. You got any good Shaboo Inn stories that you could share?
Yeah. Oh, geez. Lots of Shaboo Inn stories. The musicians that hung out there.
The Cars, right? I think the Cars played there a lot.
The Cars played there. The Police played there.
Yeah.
Dire Straits played there. Dire Straits did a live radio broadcast from there, I believe. I played with Jack Sani years later, who was with Dire Straits as well. The Shaboo All-Stars was sort of the lasting legacy. And I played with them a couple times. Lefty Foster. Mark Easton was one of my great mentors, sadly passed away the first year of from COVID. Mark had a band out there called Avalanche that was one of the heaviest rock bands that ever came out of the state. And And they were really, really big for a couple years. And then they split up. And after they split up, Mark and I got together. This was when I was doing the Dirty Bones thing, but I was also playing with Mark, and Mark was a great influence. And that's where I met Charles Calmese as well, who was Muddy Waters' bassist, also played with Ike Turner and Chuck Berry and Johnny Winter. But his probably his proudest moments were playing with Muddy Waters on the Hard Again album. And Charles kind of took me under his wing, and sadly he's no longer with us anymore, but he was a great influence of mine as well.
What was the I'd never been in the Shabu Inn, and I think it closed. Is it the 80s it closed? Maybe
it closed. I think there was a fire there. I actually went to the last show there, which was May of 1982, with a band called Max Creek, which was a big jam band at the time.
Still around?
It was still around.
Yeah, my older brother just saw them a few weeks ago. I saw them about 6 months ago. They're still rocking, man. They're
and they were really. I had a girlfriend at the time that was sort of a deadhead, so we'd always go see them. But anyway, we saw them the last show at the Shabu, and then I think the next week it burned down. But inside there, it was like the whole thing was like raw wood and everything, and the tables were like those cable spools, I mean, the place was pretty raw inside, but it just, I mean, I've been in there nights when you felt like the paint was going to melt off the walls because it was just rocking ferociously. You had a big PA system too.
Yeah, it's worthy of a book. I don't think a book's ever been written about it, but it really is.
Yeah,
worthy of a
book. I mean, Lefty Foster and Bruce Johns were two of the owners. They're still around. They should write a book because the people who played there and stayed there, because you could stay above it. Freddie King, all these Bonnie Raitt. I mean, everybody who was anybody at the time played there, because it was a good in-between place from Boston and New York,
Right. Charles Calmese, any good Muddy Waters stories that he shared with you?
A couple of times he just told me that Muddy was very, very straightforward in his blues playing. And Charles was from the south side of Chicago. He had blues in his blood and he could play anything, but sometimes he'd like to get into the funk slapping with the bass. And apparently Muddy didn't like that. He told me a couple of times that Muddy said, cut that out, So
how did you meet Jaimoe?
I met Jaimoe because I was playing in a blues band at the time called the Delrays, and we were playing a lot around the circuit, around the New England circuit, Theodore's and Springfield, a bunch of places. There've been a lot of clubs that closed that we were playing at the time. And his wife had a band, and they were a great band, and I would sit in with them occasionally, and then a couple of times I sat in with them, and Jaimoe gets on the drums. And first time I met Jaimoe, though, was we were opening for Ronnie Earl in Hartford, actually. This was when we had the Delrays, and I was playing a lot of slide guitar at the time, and I was really getting into it. It sounded great. And I looked up, and like 3 feet away from me was Jaimoe going like this. And I'm thinking, I knew exactly who it was at the time. And I'm like, oh my God, this is the guy who was Dwayne Allman's bandmate, and I was a little nervous, but I kind of got through it. And then on the break, we kind of formally introduced ourselves, and he ended up playing with the headliner that night, Ronnie Earl. He played a lot with Ronnie over the years. And Jaimoe was just a sweetheart of a guy. He's the only living Allman brother left now.
The only guy left in that band. It is one of my all-time favorite bands, the Allman Brothers Band, and he always just seemed like the nicest guy. He's been living in Connecticut for quite a while.
Yes. Yep.
So Kenny Aaronson, this is a guy who's worked with some legendary artists, along with Rick Derringer. He's worked with Bob Dylan, Billy Idol, Joan Jett and the Blackhearts, Foghat, Billy Squire, New York Dolls, Hall & Oates, and Sammy Hagar, Michael Shreve, Neil Sean, Sammy. It was HSAS. And it's a great album. It was like a one-off deal.
One-off album, and they were going to tour, Kenny told me, but then it got some record company nonsense happened.
Right. Did you meet him through Rick Derringer?
Oddly enough, I didn't. I met him. I was doing some studio work with a guy by the name of Alan St. John. And Alan was the keyboard player. He's a guy who's played with everybody, but he's most famous for playing keyboards with Billy Squire. Okay.
Yeah, the name sounds very familiar. I know I must have seen it in the credits.
And Alan's played with a lot of people. He played with John Entwistle. That was probably his second biggest gig. But anyway, he was doing some work for me on what became the first Mambo Sons record, that same thing Rick was on. I had put bass down on these tracks that I had played myself, and I'm like, I'd love to get a real bass player on this thing. And he's like, you should call Kenny Aaronson up. I'm like, okay. So I called Kenny up and talked to him quite a bit. And we kind of, he didn't know who I was, but he was cool. And he was like, love to hear the music. I sent him the tracks down. He really liked the music. And he came up, he played on, I think, all but one track on that album. And we kept in touch. So that was the first Mambo Sons. We did 3 more albums after that. The last one was a double album. And then in 2014, I really just had the itch to release more music. I was not the lead singer in the Mambo Sons. We had a great lead singer, but I'm like, you know what? I'm writing music. I'm going to sing it and put it out there. So I called Kenny. He's like, yeah, I'd love to hear it. And that was in 2014. And we did 5 my solo albums together where he played on everything. And now for the past year and a half, I've been doing singles, because that's kind of what everybody does now. And he's played on all the singles, and he's played a lot of different instruments just besides bass. He played upright bass. He's played horns, some keyboard stuff. He's a great lap steel guitar player, and he's a great guy. I love him. I love that guy. He and I also, he's played for the past dozen years with the Yardbirds, and they're still plugging around,
Really?
In 2016, they were going to record a new album of original music. They had done the album Birdland about 10 years before that with Steve Vai, a lot of like heavy guitar players. But they wanted to do their own original album. And Kenny was very active in the band, very adamant about, I got a guy I want to bring in to help write. So he brought me in, and we wrote about 5 songs. And I mean, this is one of those deals where I could taste that Jack Douglas was going to be the producer on this thing.
Speaking of Aerosmith.
And they were meeting, and then all of a sudden they pulled the plug on the album. So I'm like, it was really disappointing. And we were all disappointed. So anyway, I had 4 or 5 songs that we had written, and I was like, well, at least 3 of these are going on my next album. And I released the album American Garden in 2018. And it's got 3 of those songs that Kenny and I wrote for the Yardbirds. And I like that album a lot. A lot of people, a guy just emailed me the other day, said, I got all your albums, but I like that one the best. So it's probably the most like guitar based, rock and roll based, Well, they're all guitar based,
Yeah, I want to talk about your latest single and your latest music and what you got coming up. So, but that speaks to the music business. There's a lot of almosts, and that's you got to be ready for the ups and downs.
Yeah.
And I'm finding a lot of these musicians, just from doing these interviews, if you could play multiple instruments, if you could do more than just one thing, it's certainly going to help you a lot, because you get a lot more gigs that way.
Absolutely. And especially if you're a bass player that's a great singer, huge demand for that, or anybody, a guitar player, a drummer that's a great singer, that's a big thing too.
Booked on Rock Podcast. We'll be back after this.
Don't go away, gentlemen. We may need all of you.
It can get lonely climbing Mount McKinley, so to entertain myself, I go to ChumbaCasino.com. At Chumba Casino, I can play hundreds of online casino-style games for free, like online slots, bingo, Slingo, and more. Plus, I get a daily login bonus. It's just too bad that up here, I don't have anyone to share my excitement with. Woohoo! Woohoo!
Live the Chumba life. Anytime, anywhere. Play for free now at ChumbaCasino.com. VGW Group. No purchase necessary. Void where prohibited by law. See terms and conditions. 18+.
Our guest is Tom Guerra. So let's get into your writing career. Your articles have been published since the late 90s. Talk about how you began a career in writing.
It's funny. We were just talking about that Ronnie Earl gig that I met Jaimoe, and I'd done some other opening slots for Ronnie. And I was I subscribed to Vintage Guitar magazine for a while at that point. I really loved the magazine. And I was talking to a guy who wrote for them. He's like, what are you doing these days? I said, I'm playing this guy, doing this, blah, 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 opening for Ronnie Earl. He goes, Ronnie Earl, that's somebody we've never had in the magazine. We'd love to get him. I'm like, I could do that. And then, here we are 20-something years later. But that's how it started. I interviewed Ronnie, and it was great because I had just worked with him. I watched his whole set. I knew he was playing through a Leslie on some tunes. He was playing on it with a super reverb. He had 3 different strats. He and I were talking about the years. So, I mean, I already had this thing in my head what I was going to ask him. And it really, really worked out well. That was when he was releasing an album on, I think it was on Verve. It was a big label called The Color of Love, Color, Colour of Love. That's one, he said that's one of his favorite interviews of all time. And that actually made it into, there's a book released last year on Ronnie Earl, and there's a big section of that book that quotes that article. But he was great to work with, and he's a very caring person and a great guitar player too. So,
and writing for magazines that focus on the guitar, that's got to be fun for you, because then you could really get into some of the inner workings of it, like tone and setup and the amps you use and
absolutely
everything.
Yeah,
you could. It's like whatever you want to ask about guitars, go ahead. Whereas if you're writing for a mainstream magazine, you may not. You may have to kind of pick and choose.
Yeah, exactly, because I've sent a couple of these articles to my folks, and they're like, "Well, this is good, but it's just way too technically." I'm like, "Yeah, that's the purpose of the magazine,
It's the audience. That's the
audience, right?" And in the early days of vintage guitar, it was a little bit more free form, where you could give them like 2,000 words on Ronnie Earl or whatever, and it was great. And now it's just a little bit more like every publication is just slimmed down a lot,
Guitar tone is, to me, is fascinating. I don't think there's any 2 guitarists with the same guitar tone. It's
totally,
like an individual,
totally great.
Yeah. I mean, how does one go about getting a guitar tone? There's various components. It's the amp. It's the guitar you're using. It's a bunch of things.
It's your fingers. It's your picking. It's your left hand and how you fret. When I work for guitar tone, I usually am working on a song, and I'm like the song we're going to talk about in a little bit, the new single that's coming up next month. I had a specific guitar sound in my mind that I wanted to use, and it was a muted guitar sound. It was an arpeggiated part, but a muted guitar tone. So I took a piece of foam, actually, I stuffed it under the bridge of that strat right there. And it was and it sounded, that's exactly how I wanted it. So it's kind of knowing what the song you're going, I mean, I'm talking in the studio. Live is a different story. But in the studio, you come up with an idea for a song. And I mean, when you write a song, and that's the most fun thing I do, musically, is I just love the creative aspect. When you write a song, it's like you get one piece of a puzzle, and it's up to you to build that puzzle out however you want it. And a lot of that is, from my experience and what I do, is guitar related, and I really try to take the time to make the guitar sound not necessarily different song to song, but it does end up being like that, because I don't like to repeat myself tone wise, and use whatever you got to do to get that tone. Different amps, different microphones. Sometimes you mic the amp closely, sometimes you mic the room. I do both, and then I blend them together depending on what part of the song is. For a solo, sometimes I like to have kind of a room mic to make it sound really big, but sometimes for a tight rhythm part, you want to use more of the close mic. Different amps have different sounds. Different guitars have different sounds. Sometimes you use a pedal. Sometimes you use a guitar, a chord, and an amp. That's what I usually use,
Are you your own producer, engineer? Do you have outside people sometimes?
I don't master myself, but I typically will record, engineer, and mix myself. And then I'll send it out to somebody I trust mastering wise. And at that point, it's good, because at that point you're going nuts because you've heard this song 300 times, or whatever.
Right.
And you need a second set of ears. I work with a company out of Chicago called Massive Mastering, a guy by the name of John Scripp, who's great. He and I work closely when he's mastering it, but he'll take it from me, and then he'll do his thing and he'll send it back. And I'm like, well, this sounds great, but I think we need to maybe not squash the drums as much, or whatever, and go back and forth. So it is a little bit of an iterative process.
I was just reading an article on the Black Crowes, Chris and Rich Robinson being interviewed because they're up for a Grammy. This new album they put out, which I really like.
Yeah.
And they're up there with the Stones, Hackney Diamonds, and I think Jack White's album's nominated as well. But anyway, in the story, in the article, they talked about the album, and this album in particular, they decided to get an outside producer because I believe they would produce their own work. That's interesting to me because they purposely wanted somebody from the outside, and they weren't afraid to have somebody who's going to tell them, no, I don't like that.
Right.
I like that. I don't like that. Let's cut that out. Let's,
And that's the toughest thing when you're doing it yourself is to
when you've been around for a while too, right? If you're a musician who's been around for a lot of times, musicians say, "I don't need a producer anymore." And
right, and it's that self-editing, and I try to be as critical as possible. Like a lot of the songs that I initially record will be 4.5 minutes long, and I'll listen. I'm like, it doesn't need that extra chorus here. And nowadays, I mean, I did a lot of work in studios when it was tape, and I got to actually use a razor blade and learn how to edit that way. But when the digital revolution started in the late 1990s, the editing capabilities, that's what I like about recording on digital the most. You know, it's none of the, I mean, you can go nuts with digital with stuff like auto-tune and just phony stuff, you know, yeah. And I like to keep my music real, but it does have a great editing capability, and it takes you just so much less time to edit.
I was about to say ease of use. David Gilmour was on Jimmy Fallon. I think it was Fallon. And here's a guy who's old school. You would think, I don't need the new technology. You really need to go old school. And he's like, I love this stuff because it makes can you imagine if they did Dark Side of the Moon now? They would have been done with that thing a hell of a lot quicker.
I know.
Because that was all old school, cutting, splicing, getting real sound effects, et cetera, et cetera.
I had, in the early days of digital, I had a system that a year or so after I bought it, the company mothballed it. But I used it until last year, like 20 years post mothballing, because it had just the greatest sounding drivers in there. And I loved working in this. And people are like, that's what do you got on your guitar? It sounds great there. I'm like, it's just, I had mentioned, but anyway, it got to the point where, I mean, I was running on like Windows XP, and that was an upgraded version from the initial version, and they stopped updating it. And I just said, I got to get into the 21st century here.
Yeah, so, bummer.
You know, yeah.
Yeah. I can relate in a sense of, as a podcaster, I actually enjoy the editing process as long as I'm using software I love. And in radio, when I was producing commercials, I was introduced to Sony Vegas.
Yeah.
And this is, endless tracks. And just the ease of use, you could move everything around, the audio, this, that, the other. And I've tried other systems, and they would drive me insane. It was like it was buffering too long. When you have something that works, you just stick with it.
Absolutely,
unless the software updates tell you can't anymore.
Right. And I think it's because there's only so much time you can spend on this stuff, and you want to be spending it creating versus programming. Right. You know, that's my personal take on it. But I mean, I know a lot of people are a lot more technical with it than me, but I know how to use it. I know how to use it to satisfy what I'm trying to do. Yeah. And that's cool. And, like when I'm working with Kenny or something, he's got his own system as well. So he'll model some stuff there, and then we'll bring it in here, and it works out well,
You have interviews on your website, so people can check that out. It's on tomguerra.com. Last name spelled Guerra, so TOMGUERRA.com. You have a recent one. I think it's recent with Elliot Easton of the Cars.
Yeah, I did that in 2024.
Extremely underrated guitarist.
Oh my God. One of my favorite guitar players, because he's brilliant, because his guitar solos are sort of like songs within a song. You know, of course, he had a great song. Rick Ocasek was a great writer to begin with. Ben Orr was a great singer. So, that brought his game up. But Elliot just came up with so many cool parts. He's always been an idol of mine, Nice
I want to ask you about that. What's more difficult, a solo or a riff?
To me, it depends. Sometimes I'll start a song off with a riff that I came up with. I did a song last year called Mutilated World, and that's exactly how that. I was playing that riff for like days, that repetitive, slow riff, almost like a free type of riff, Then I overdubbed the guitar solo on there, made the guitar solo sound. It was again, using the room. It sounds really, really big and kind of lots of reverb on there too. So it depends. Every song is a little different. Sometimes, I never will write a song based upon a guitar solo. To me, I love guitar solos. I have them in most of my songs, although the new one's not going to have a guitar solo in it. But guitar solos to me are like frosting on the cake. It's really sweet. I like it, but you need that cake, and the song is the cake.
Sure. I think of David Gilmour and the Comfortably Numb guitar solo. They talk about how amazing that is, and you just think how hard that must be. And did he do it in one take? Did he have it in his head beforehand? Did it just let's start recording and I'll see what I come up with? Because is there a certain type of day that's better to do that? Because you have to really feel something coming through you when you're doing those solos.
It's interesting.
They stand out. It's like the spotlight's on that solo for those
absolutely
30 seconds, 60 seconds, whatever.
Yeah. And it's interesting, the time of day thing you just brought up. I do 90% of my writing in like the first hour I'm awake, because I just have these thoughts. And sometimes I don't even think I'm awake when I have these ideas. So that's kind of where I come up with that. But a lot of times, usually most of the guitar solos that I put down on my records or on my songs are first or second take, because usually when I'm totally clear and I play something, sometimes it's worked out in my brain a little bit, and sometimes you may do it a second time. But after that, I always find myself repeating what I did in that first or second take. So even though those first or second takes might not be perfect, they are definitely the best feeling, for me at least. Yeah.
You've interviewed Ian Hunter, Jim Weeder, Mike Campbell of Tom Petty's Heartbreakers. There's a photo or two of you with Mike, the late great Jay Giles you interviewed. If you had to pick a highlight interview or two, do you have any that stand out?
A lot of the early interviews with Johnny Winter, I thought were high points because we got to be friends. So that was cool. Mike Campbell, interviewed him a couple times, spent some time with him, and he was a real sweet guy. He's like, "Oh, check this out. It's my 52 Telly." And I'm like,
my favorite is Mojo, I think, of all of his tone,
album.
that Peter Green tone on that album is great.
Yeah, that's when he had just gotten a 59 Les Paul.
Yeah.
And that's what he was playing on that quite a bit. But all of them have been interesting in their own way. I mean, I loved spending time with Jay Giles. He was a really nice guy and really serious about he was a jazz musician in his later years. Ian Hunter, loved him because I love his music, love his songwriting. Interviewed him 3 or 4 times. John Hyatt. I mean, I bumped into John Hyatt in a Starbucks. And next thing I said, "Hey, John, how you doing? I'm Tom Guerra, write for Vintage Guitar." He's like, "Oh, let's have a coffee." Ended up spending the afternoon with him. He smoked about 3 cigars and we're just sitting there. I'm like, "Okay, let's set a date. I'm going to interview you." And the date we had set was the next week, which was 9/11. And we're like, "Okay, we're not going to do the interview today." So we did it a couple of weeks after that. But that was a cool story. So
another underrated artist,
just insanely great, songwriter.
Bucket list. Do you have a bucket list? Like, who would you love to interview?
I think I'd love to interview Keith Richards. Just because I've been a massive Stones fan since I was pre-teen years.
He lives in Connecticut, so
I know. So any of the surviving Beatles, would have loved to interview George Harrison because I really liked. He's sort of the prototype for Elliot Easton in terms of playing what fits the song. Would have loved to interview Jeff Beck. Was a huge Beck fan. Did a show on Trinity's college radio station right after he died. That was a tribute show to Jeff Beck. Rory Gallagher, these guys are kind of like my guitar heroes. But
how about new guitarists or newer? I mentioned Jack Way, he's been around for a while, but guys who maybe been around for 10, 20 years that you love listening to these days.
Everybody I see that's brand new is great on the guitar. I mean, I think the technical ability of guitar players, I mean, when I was coming up, it was like the bar was Hendrix, okay? You could maybe get to that level if you really, really worked hard. I mean, play that stuff, not necessarily come up with it. Then Eddie Van Halen came out, and that was sort of the next big threshold of guitar playing. And for many years, people, doing this stuff, Eddie Van Halen stuff, even Randy Rhoads, who was a great player, I think felt like he hadn't developed enough off of that Eddie Van Halen style, by the time he passed really young. Then, Stevie Ray came in. He was like the next big guitar player, hero. And a lot of people started playing that style of blues. I mean, I played a lot of blues before that, didn't really play that style, but everybody who came afterwards played that style of blues. But the technical ability, and I think a lot of it has to do with YouTube, the facilities available to people are just you want to learn guitar, just go on YouTube. I've got a friend of mine who wanted to learn guitar. He's a couple years younger than me. I said, go on YouTube, get a decent guitar, go on YouTube. You can learn anything. So I think the quality of musicianship and guitar playing has increased over the years, the technical aspect. That being said, I'm kind of always rooted in the stuff that I grew up on. I do listen to all sorts of music, but that's sort of my favorite stuff. I saw a band last year, Guster, a post sort of my generation band, but they were great. They were fantastic, and those guys are probably 10, 15 years younger than me. So
Gary Clark Jr., you're a fan of?
Joe Bonamassa?
Yeah, those are
all great guitar players. I actually have a good Joe Bonamassa story. When he was probably 13 years old, his dad, Lenny, was a vintage guitar dealer. And we used to always go to I think it was the East Village. There was a annual New York City guitar show. This was like in the late 80s. I was down there and I was talking to Lenny Bonamassa. He had this old beat up Strat like Rory Gallagher's. I said, what do you want for it? He told me, and I'm like, we were like $300 apart. He wasn't moving, I wasn't moving, but I wish I had bought that Strat. But he's like, here, Joey, here, give it to the man, and that's where I met Joe Bonamassa. He was probably 14 years old then. And he was, he was great then too.
Was he?
So he's a guy I really admire because the music industry has gotten harder and harder and harder. And that guy, he's done it all on his own. He has made it on his own. He's got a ridiculous guitar collection, but I admire that, the fact that this guy has done it on his own.
Booked on Rock Podcast. We'll be back after this.
We'll be back with the Magic Tunes for the Armada Room's 2-hour disco swing party after this short break. Till then, don't you go changing.
Looking for excitement? Chumba Casino is here. Play anytime, play anywhere. Play on the train, play at the store, play at home, play when you're bored. Play today for your chance to win and get daily bonuses when you log in. So what are you waiting for? Don't delay. Chumba Casino is free to play.
Experience social gameplay like never before. Go to Chumba Casino right now to play hundreds of games, including online slots, bingo, Slingo, and more. Live the Chumba life at ChumbaCasino.com. VGW Group. No purchase necessary. Void where prohibited by law. See terms and conditions. 18+.
Your career with your own bands, does this go back? Yeah. 99 was your first band, Mamo Sons?
No, that was not my first band. The first band was the first band that really made any noise was the Dirty Bones. I think we formed in like 82. We played a lot of colleges around, and it was really taught. We were like fish out of water because at the time the big thing was MTV rock. These bands, these skinny English guys with their little skinny ties. And we're like, somebody saw us one time and said, oh my God, this band looks like Jesus and his disciples. We were all like shaggy people,
Yeah.
And we played quite a bit, like really our own, one reporter said, this is a grime and gristle rock and roll band. I'm like, I can live with that. That's exactly right. Our singer sounded like John Kay of Steppenwolf. So it was just had that raw voice. So that kind of took me until the 90s, and I played blues, a couple blues bands throughout the 90s, and then had a chance to do my own thing and put together the Mambo Sons in 99. That lasted, that's still kind of going on today. We still play occasionally, but in terms of recording career, that lasted about 10 years. Okay. And then have done my own original albums since 2014, every 2 years. And then I started doing singles last year and I think I've done five or six singles over the last year, getting ready to release the next one.
Yes. Good Times, Big Fun, which is a great song. I love it. Tell us about this song. Who's on the track?
Oh, yeah.
Where people can hear it.
Good Times, Big Fun was the one we released in September. And it's me, Kenny Aaronson, and Mike Kozak, who's the drummer. You can stream it. All of the streaming platforms have my music, Apple, Spotify. You can listen on my website. You can buy CDs off my website of my albums that I released physically up until 2022, I think it was. But yeah, all of the singles are available on all the streaming platforms. Good Time, Big Fun is about a father talking to his son. He feels like his son's going to break up with his girlfriend, and it's kind of a pep talk the father's giving the son. And then, with lots of guitar and it's got kind of a false ending. And then it goes into sort of this, almost like this real up tempo punky thing with some with some wild guitar playing on it. And it's just the three of us who did that one, Mike, Kenny, and me.
And the tone, I love it's like a crunchy tone. Is that a good word?
Yeah. It's kind of a crunchy tone on both the rhythm guitars, and then the lead guitar part at the end. A friend of mine who's a great guitar player himself said, you know what? He goes, I'm listening to this solo. It sounds like 5 of my favorite guitar players. I'm like, okay, who are they? And he mentioned, well, this part sounds like Hendrix. This part sounds like Jimmy Page. I'm like, yeah, you're right. Yeah, you got me, So it just that just kind of, again, one of those situations where the whole thing was a first take, and it's, it's not technically perfect, but I think it kicks butt, Yeah.
Is there a YouTube video? I know the song's on YouTube.
Yeah, there's not a YouTube video of that, but I've got a whole bunch of different YouTube videos. A lot of them we produced during COVID because everybody was climbing the walls. And John Butcher, who's a dear friend of mine who was played on a lot of my music, he's a fantastic guitar player. He's produced a bunch of my videos as well. He played on my single that came out in, I think it was June of this year. That's called Television Dreams, and it's got a wild guitar part in there that John Butcher plays. He and I also did a vocal duet on a song called California's Got to My Girl. He sings beautifully on that too. Yeah,
all these are on your website, and I also put together a playlist for each episode. So if they're on Spotify, I'll pull them and we'll put them in the episode playlist. I love the picture for the single for Good Times, Big Fun. Where was that taken?
That was taken in I think it was the Southwest. I did not take that picture. I worked with a graphic designer by the name of John Callio, who's done everything I think I've ever done since the second Mambo Sons record. He just did the graphic for the upcoming release that has the Saturday Night Live tie. He did a really nice job on that. It's really real pretty graphics,
Let's get to it now. Christine Allman, the Beehive Queen.
The Beehive Queen,
exactly. Beehive Queen, yeah. So you have a project with Christine.
Yep.
She has been a member of the Saturday Night Live band since 1991. Is she still working with the SNL band?
She absolutely is, yeah. And
how did you meet her?
I met her many years ago. A friend of mine was her guitar player, Eric Fletcher, and we met back then. And I always loved her. I mean, I actually saw her in the late 70s. She was with a band called the Scratch Band, and she was the only female in the band, and everybody was in love with her, and she just had such a beautiful, strong, kicking voice. They did a cover of that old Dusty Springfield song, I Only Want to Be With You. You should check that out. It's on YouTube. It's just, It'll make your heart melt. So I always loved her voice. When I started doing my singles, I kind of got in touch with her again. She's on the Sudden Signs of Grace video that I did. I just remember that. That's a really good video. It's got like a bunch of guest stars, ranging from guys from Dire Straits to the Georgia Satellites. And anyway, so I'm writing, these new tunes, and I'd sent her Television Dreams, and she's like, and I said, hey, can you find a part on this? And she's like, this song's ready to go, let's put it out like this. So I'm like, okay, well, the next one. So next one was Good Times, Big Fun. I'm like, now that's a rocker. I want to kind of keep that. But then I started working on the new song. I had written kind of a counterpart for a female. It's kind of a boy-girl song, That's the one where I used the muted Stratocaster. And I sent it to her, and she's like, I love this. She's like, I definitely will do it. So she came up, we tracked her vocal, did like 3 or 4 different versions of what she was going to do. And I said, this is what I think we should do. And I played it for her. She goes, yeah, do that. I'm like, I want to kind of put a little bit of shimmer on your voice. Is it okay? And she's like, no, that sounds great. Let's do that. So she's on the track. It's going to be called Chi Chi Chu, CHICHICHU. And it's about a guy kind of pining for his girlfriend after she throws him out. And Christine comes in on the second verse and sort of does an answer vocal. It's really it's a cool song. It's kind of like a Tex-Mex feel. Kenny and I worked up some almost mariachi sounding trumpets on it. So no guitar solo, but it's not really about that. It's sort of kind of like R&B Tex-Mex with some soul in there. Christine's got a lot of soul. So yeah, that's it. It'll be out in the next couple of weeks. Yeah.
January release.
Yeah, January 7th. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to that single, and people can subscribe if they go to your website. I believe all the links to your Facebook, all your social media.
Yeah.
sites are there, so people can check that out again. TomGuerra.com, TomGuerra.com, so people can check that out. Booked on Rock Podcast. We'll be back after this.
Pull out your pants pockets. All kids of the future wear their pants inside out.
Step into the world of power, loyalty, and luck.
I'm gonna make him an offer he can't refuse.
With family, cannolis, and spins mean everything.
Now, you wanna get mixed up in the family business.
Introducing The Godfather at ChumbaCasino.com. Test your luck in the shadowy world of The Godfather slot.
Someday, I will call upon you to do a service for me.
Play The Godfather now at ChumbaCasino.com.
Welcome to the family.
No purchase necessary. VGW Group. Void where prohibited by law. 18 plus. Terms and conditions apply.
I always ask guests who come on for this series, I call the dialogue series.
Yeah.
Books that you've read, books that you want to read, books that you wish were written. And man, you sent me a list. This is quite a list. I love it.
I read every single night. Most of the reading that I really enjoy are biographies or autobiographies, just because I find people's lives fascinating. One of my favorite books of all time is called Last Train to Memphis. It's about the early Elvis days. Peter Guralnick wrote that. Fantastic book. Loved Keith Richards' book, Life. There's a great book that Mo Foster, who used to be the bass player for a lot of people, including Jeff Beck, wrote about the early days of British rock and roll called 17 Watts. Yeah. Great book. And 17 watts was like everybody used this Watkins amp that was 17 watts. So that's kind of how they named it, how Mo named it. My friend Mary Lou Sullivan wrote a great book on Johnny Winter, and that's definitely one of my favorite rock and roll books as well.
That's called Raising Cain.
Raising Cain. Yeah, that's a great one. And, I also liked the Ike Turner book, and that was called Taking Back My Name. Ike is maligned because, Tina said he was not a nice guy, and I'm sure a lot of that is true. But Ike was really important in the development of rock and roll and the crossing over of blues. He was an early Sun artist. He got Howlin' Wolf on Sun. He was really one of the first guys that put together traveling bands. And Ike Turner was on the first rock and roll single, which is Rocket 88. I mean, that was his band. By the time it came out, they kind of gave Jackie Brenston, who sang that, the kudos, and the name appeared on the title. But Ike was there.
Tell me about Heavy Load, the Free bio. I didn't even know there was a bio on Free. It's on Bad Company and Free.
Yeah, it's 90% free. Yeah, Todd Clayton wrote that. David Clayton, I'm sorry. And Todd Smith, I think is his last name, wrote that book. And that's a really good book, kind of in a strange format. It's almost like in a high school yearbook publishing format. So they probably self-published it, and they got somebody like that to produce it. But it's a great book about how Free kind of came about, their rise, their breakup for the first time. They got back together, they broke up again, and then Kossoff kind of spun out of control, sadly. But yeah, that's a really good book. I had reviewed that right around the time it came out for Vintage and interviewed both Simon Kirke, the drummer, and Rabbit Bundrick. Rabbit, for many years after he left Free, went on to play with The Who, but he joined Free for their last album, Heartbreaker, and he was a really great musician. So he had a ground zero type insight of Free and the pros and the cons of what happened there.
What's this one? Astral Weeks, Van Morrison in Boston? Is this specific to Boston?
Yeah, that's a great book that was written about apparently after Van and the Them broke up in like 67, I think, 68. He moved to Boston, and he was living in New York, working for, I think, Bang Records, and moved to Boston and actually got together with some musicians up there. And I know the son of his bass player, Thomas Kilbania. Tommy Kilbania is a drummer, but his bass player, Thomas Kilbania, was part of that. It's a really interesting look at what was going on in the Boston music scene then, too. It's definitely worth checking out.
Now, another one I want to ask you about here, Never a Dull Moment, Rock and Roll in the year 1971. That year, it really is fascinating to look back at that year. This is David Hepworth.
Right. That is a book I just got, and I got 3 books that I'm reading right now. One is that, which is fascinating. The other one is the book by Alex Van Halen, that I really am starting to like.
Yeah,
And
I've already read. Well, I did the audio.
Okay, yeah, and I'm looking forward to that. And it reminds me of, I've got a brother who's a year and a half older, so I can kind of relate to how Alex, who was the older brother, and his younger brother Eddie kind of got along and fought as young kids, that type of thing.
What do you think about Alex as a drummer? Underrated?
I think he's totally underrated. I think he's a great drummer. Yeah.
Yeah.
If his brother wasn't Edward Van Halen, we would be talking about Alex like John Bonham, I think,
I always say this, it's the interplay between him and Ed during solos, which is the most interesting aspect of Alex's drumming, his work on the cymbals and the way they were locked in all the time.
Oh yeah.
It's something to behold. That's for sure. That's my favorite band. So
yeah.
Let's see what else we got here. We're running through them. A lot of good stuff. Oh, Crosby, Stills and Nash and Young bio.
Yeah.
Dear Mr. Fantasy, Island Records. Is it about Island Records?
It's about Island Records. Okay. That's a great book. Yeah. It's got all the Island bands in there. Speaking about Island Records, I just did a song last week with Luther Grosvenor, who joined Mott the Hoople and was renamed Ariel Bender. But he was in an early Island band called Spooky Tooth. He had asked me to play guitar on one of his new songs, which is a cool kind of slow blues song. And I got to play a little bit of kind of sparse electric on that. So that was a cool thing. That'll be out, I think, in April. So.
Oh, cool. What's this one, Ballad Hunting by Max Hunter? What's this about?
Yeah, that was a book somebody gave me. And it was about a guy who in the 40s and 50s would go around to really all of these impoverished areas of the United States and try to track down original folk songs. So it was quite interesting to read that.
How about Elvis Costello's bio? Anything that surprised you from the book that you didn't know about him in the book?
I think he's a brilliant songwriter, and he really gets into minutia, as does Pete Townshend on his biography. But it was an enjoyable book. I learned a lot about Elvis and how he kind of grew up in England, kind of in the shadow of the Beatles. I guess everybody was in the shadow of the Beatles, but I didn't realize until I read it how huge of an influence as a songwriter they were on him. But now going back and listening to some of his music, especially his second album, This Year's Model, you can hear some of those changes. Like, that's a Beatles change.
Every time I hear a song that has multiple sounds all together that almost create one sound, I think of Phil Spector. You read the book, The Rise and Fall of Phil Spector. What a tragic story. Brilliant guy, but obviously had mental health issues.
And they were, I think, from his teenage years, which you learn some of the stuff he went through. So I think that was always with him. And I think it came out as he aged a lot more,
Tearing Down the Wall of Sound, The Rise and Fall of Phil Spector. Does that sound right?
Yes, that's it.
So that would be Mick Brown.
Okay.
Yeah, he's a very well-known author.
Yep.
Let's see. History of Aerosmith Tour Journal.
That was a book that a guy who I helped sell off his guitar collection sent me. He was a big Aerosmith fan, and he lived in Boston during the early 70s when they were up there, and followed him around. I don't know if it's a fan club book or whatever, but it is a book about the early days of Aerosmith and has every single date they ever played up until the Rocks period, which was coincidentally up until that point, they were one of my favorite bands. I mean, I thought Rocks was a masterpiece for them. Same with Toys. That book has some great pictures in it.
So the Shabu Inn would be in that book.
It probably would be. Yeah, I think it is actually.
Yeah. Now here's one, Laurel Canyon, The Inside Story. These are the books that you want to read. Is Brothers by Alex.
I haven't picked that up yet, but I want to read that because I'm fascinated with Laurel Canyon and
Michael Walker.
The songwriters. Yeah. And I did a song earlier in 2024, I think it was January 24, called Sister Topanga. And it's my tribute to all of those female songwriters from Laurel Canyon. So I definitely got to read that.
All right. Now we finished with what books on rock you'd like to see written that haven't been yet. These are always fun. Would love to see another book on the detailed history of Island Records.
Yeah, more detailed than the one that I did read, because I think that's fascinating. I did read the Chris Blackwell autobiography, and that was fascinating. And that probably is as close as you'll get. Although, you think of Island Records, I mean, those are some of my all-time favorite bands, whether it's Traffic, Mott the Hoople, Free, Spooky Tooth, Steve Winwood came out of there as a solo artist as well.
It wasn't U2 Island Records?
I think they were. I think they actually got so big that Island Records sold to another label because U2 got so massive, you know?
Yeah, and I believe was Bob Marley?
Oh, yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Yep.
Just talked to Peter Ames Carlin, great book on REM, and that's the same thing with like IRS Records. They were happy with the label because they let them do what they want artistically, but they didn't have the resources to help really bring them to a wider audience. So, like if you go to Europe, they couldn't stock any albums out in Europe, so they didn't have much of a following there. So eventually the band outgrows these type of labels.
Exactly. And I think a lot of bands outgrew Island. I mean, Mott outgrew them, certainly, and went to Columbia and kind of got huge for a while at least.
Would love to see a book on the changing world of live local music. From 1965 to 1980, the main source of entertainment for young people was live music. This started to change in the 80s and is now much more sporadic.
That's a big, big thing. And I mean, I talk about a niche book, but I was thinking I would really love, especially now where a lot of the guys who are in bands are really getting older, active bands, you know. I was talking to a friend of mine who's 75, and he played in a lot of popular bands from the mid 60s to up until a couple of years ago. In those days, in those late 60s, early 70s days, that's what you did for entertainment as a kid. You'd go to a club and you see this band. You'd leave that club, go to see that band. Leave that club, go to the third club and see another band. And that was really the main form of entertainment. As a result, music really, a lot of music flourished, you know, and some bands actually did well making it out of Connecticut as well.
And that's where a lot of those great bands cut their teeth, and they really get that sound down before it's time to make the first album.
And everybody, even if they're a famous musician, had those sort of, kind of post garage days when they were in their early club days. We could tell some stories, I'm sure. I mean, we would all have the same opinion of certain club owners.
Did you hear just heard that Southside Johnny was forced into immediate retirement, as they put it in the headline.
I saw that. Yeah.
Yeah. He played 2 songs at the last show and then walked off stage, and the rest of the band finished the show.
Yeah.
So I don't know what's going on with that, but it just speaks to, a lot of these artists, they're towards the end or at the end.
Same thing happened to Frank Marino last year, where all of a sudden they put out a statement saying he'll never play live again. So, and I know Robin Trower has had some recent health issues, but I think he's coming back to the States. Another great guitar player.
So TomGuerra.com, and then you have Facebook, do you have Twitter, do you have X? You got all those covered?
All that stuff.
Right.
Yep.
And YouTube.
Yeah.
As well. Okay.
A lot of stuff on YouTube. Yeah.
All right. Tom Guerra, thanks, man. This was great.
Thanks so much, Eric. It's been great talking to you. You really came up with some great questions too. I really enjoyed it.
Well, now, that was an adventure.
That was quite a show you put on today.
Well, let me just close this conversation by saying you are one unique individual.
Looking for excitement? Chumba Casino is here. Play anytime, play anywhere. Play on the train, play at the store, play at home, play when you're bored. Play today for your chance to win and get daily bonuses when you log in. So what are you waiting for? Don't delay. Chumba Casino is free to play.
Experience social gameplay like never before. Go to Chumba Casino right now to play hundreds of games, including online slots, bingo, Slingo, and more. Live the Chumba life at ChumbaCasino.com. VGW Group. No purchase necessary. Void where prohibited by law. See terms and conditions. 18+.